Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today, as I've sort of been teasing for quite a while, I'm finally doing the video that I've been meaning to do for a while, which is all about literary references in the work of one of my favourite artists of all time, Kate Bush. So for those of you who are unaware, Kate Bush is a British singer-songwriter who has sort of had quite a trailblazing career in many ways, and I could ramble about this for literally hours because I love her, but she is sort of one of those sort of artists who really paved the way for a lot of other artists, and was sort of seen as a bit of a visionary in her time, and is still, in her sort of most recent work, has been creating albums that are still incredibly visionary, in my opinion. And I have had, I sort of fell in love with her when I sort of first listened to her. I was kind of one of those teenagers who was just like, I really love Kate Bush and all these like other really cool artists, which, you know, is one way of not only being like, hello everyone, I'm a homosexual, but it's also a way of kind of, it was just sort of, she's just an artist who meant so much and still means so much to me. I find her work incredibly moving and touching and funny and warm and loving, and in many ways she is, she sort of feels very much like she sort of is a writer as well in some ways, just because her music is often so literary in its references. And so that's what I'm going to be doing a little bit today, sort of with the aid of a couple of websites that I'll put kind of down below, looking through the albums and discography of the wonderful Kate Bush, and seeing some of the books, and kind of basically creating a bit of a reading list from all of that. So let's go. So from that first album, The Kick Inside, that she released way back in 1978, there was a certain single called Wuthering Heights, and not too hard to guess what the literary reference is there. It is, of course, Jane Eyre. No, it's Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And this song is, I mean, obviously takes its reference from there. Kate Bush herself actually wrote the song after seeing the film and then read the book afterwards to kind of make sure she got it all right. But essentially the song details, you know, it takes so many of the parts from the book and really plays them out. So, you know, It's Me, You're Kathy, and really pulls out a lot of those references. And also she wrote it when she was incredibly young, and that kind of just makes me feel like I've done nothing with my life. Like, Kate just wrote that book, wrote that song, and changed the world, and I don't know what I was doing at that time in my life, but anyway. And so that was, you know, I think right from the beginning, that's the kind of thing where people kind of pegged her as a bit of a, you know, somebody who enjoyed literature. And it's interesting that from there we go to look at some other books, and sort of pieces of art that have kind of influenced her work in quite a big way. Moving on from that, in that same album, Kate also in the song Them Heavy People references the philosopher and sort of mystic thinker George Gurdjieff in Them Heavy People. And his work, I mean, adding into the reading list, I've not read anything of his, but you can sort of start to see that as kind of quite a young woman, she was sort of already bringing in quite kind of out there ideas. There's also a murder ballad, or sort of a sort of very sad ballad, inspired by the murder ballad by Lizzie One, in The Kick Inside. So lots of kind of references coming out already, but some that kind of make for bigger literary references than others. And that takes us to her second album, which I actually have an LP of, and I think my dad found it ages ago and just decided that this was exactly what his sort of his sort of like teenage gay son needed. It was just like a giant giant LP of good old Kate with the album Lionheart. And so this album directly, well, there is a song called In Search of Peter Pan. Again, not too, you don't have to dig too far to find what that reference is there, although it kind of mostly references the play version. And the lyrics of that really do go into it, and kind of really detail kind of bits of it. There's a sort of refrain of When You Wish Upon a Star. There are kind of lots of things going on that reference that book. And it's been a really long time since I've read Peter Pan. I need to go back and read it. But you can see sort of how that influence starts to come in, and we see it in the lyrics, which are also in this LP. I love this. And so you've got, you know, for example, yes, so I will be an astronaut and find Peter Pan, second star on the right, straight on till morning. And it sort of references Peter Pan throughout, and it's just absolutely gorgeous as a song. It's so beautiful. And we can see, you know, Kate is already kind of starting to get more influence there with even more literature. I realise this sounds a little bit like I'm obsessed with her. Maybe I am. I was actually planning on wearing a Kate Bush t-shirt for this. But essentially, I had this amazing Kate Bush t-shirt that I love. Like, I got it for my birthday years and years and years ago. And then I sort of found it a bit ago, and part of the kind of enamel or whatever it is that kind of had her face on the front of it kind of wore off a little bit. So it kind of looked, essentially, it was kind of Kate Bush missing like half of her face, which I felt maybe wasn't the aesthetic I was going for this. Anyhow, but on that same album, she also references a play called Arsenic and Old Lace, which is by Joseph Kesselring. And so this is a very black comedy. It involves quite a lot of murder. People are poisoning each other. It's quite aggressive. I, again, have not read this, but it is sort of referenced in the song, which I've just forgotten, Coffee Home Ground, which is all done with this kind of faux, like, German, Austrian accent of kind of talking about poisoning each other and like, ha ha ha, I will poison you. A little bit of hemlock. It's bizarre. I love it. It's Kate's earlier albums are really, I was going to say just her early albums are quite bonkers. Most of them are, in their own way. And that's why we love her. So Kate then has kind of, in these first albums, has sort of really sort of established that literary references are going to happen. And we see that moving into the next album again. And this is where some of these references get a little bit more sort of film of a book kind of style. So there is a song called The Infant Kiss, and there was also a French version of it. But she starts bringing in this idea of these young... there's a governess who basically falls in love or has sort of sexual or romantic feelings for a young man that she's looking after. But he has the sort of spirit sort of possessed by a grown man. So there's this kind of weird thing of her sort of feeling some kind of bond with this young boy, but there's kind of a man inside. All a bit scary. And that was from the film The Innocence, which in itself was inspired by The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. I'm not the biggest Henry James fan. The Turn of the Screw is really quite creepy, actually, and is kind of, I really enjoyed. That's his own sort of horror, when Henry James sort of did a bit more of the kind of horror, gothic-y sort of stuff. And it has that kind of, any sort of film you watch now, basically, with kind of creepy children, Henry James was kind of doing that quite a while ago. Like, Henry James was sort of on top of the whole, let's have slightly weird situations with very weird children. It's sort of very kind of Children of the Corn, very creepy, very odd, weird, all of that fun stuff. And that is where we start seeing The Turn of the Screw sort of referenced in that. It's a really weird song, actually. I think it was one that she sort of, not necessarily got in trouble for, but a lot of people thought was quite weird when she released it, because, you know, like, it's got lyrics like, you know, what is this, an infant's kiss, sends my body trembling. Which, you know, on radio, I can imagine it's one of those things where people are singing along and they're like, sorry, what? But that is a literary reference, and so does she get away with it? I think she does. But we see, you know, these kind of literary references are still kind of coming through, and it's kind of a fun one to add to this reading list. You know, we've already had like George Gurdjieff, now we've got Turn of the Screw, this sort of gothic horror story. What will she do next? And around the time that artists normally have a bit of an experimental bit in their career, both, well, whether writers or musicians or whatever, her fourth album, The Dreaming, was kind of just out there. So, I mean, I never really stopped and thought, I mean, the album sounds a lot more out there, and is just a lot more bizarre. Like, it has a lot more kind of overdubs of voices. It's got a lot of instrumentation. The lyrics are kind of a bit balmy. There's a lot more kind of playing around with her voice, in the same way that many novelists sort of around their sort of third or fourth books might just kind of be like, sod it, I'm going over here. And apparently, you know, she was also really suffering from writer's block, was really struggling with kind of work pressure and all of those sorts of things at the time of this album, The Dreaming. But it's really funny actually looking through some of this and looking at what was happening in this album, just in terms of, let me just find you a little bit from Wikipedia, of talking about what this little part here, which I think just for me sums up this album so brilliantly. Its songs draw inspiration from a variety of sources, including old crime films, a documentary about the war in Vietnam, the plight of Indigenous Australians, the life of Houdini, and Stephen King's novel The Shining. So like that in and of itself is sort of like, okay, what is going on here? That's like, that's a bit left field. And as I mentioned, Stephen King here with The Shining, you know, which was an influence for the song Get Out of My House, which, personal story here, my friend and I, around the time I was getting into Kate Bush, and I think I was probably about 17 or 18, I was obsessed with this album because of how like balmy it is. And it's great listening back to it sort of like years later. I realize how much I actually do love it and how much of a real character this album has. But it's really funny, the song Get Out of My House, the one sponsored by inspired by The Shining, my friend and I just found hilarious, just because at one point she does just scream "Get out of my house," which in my mind as like an 18-year-old was sort of up there with like EastEnders, which is for non-UK viewers is like a British soap. But there was a whole thing of like of people like these sort of pub owners yelling like, "Get out of my pub!" And I still to this day, years later, cannot hear the song "Get Out of My House" where Kate screams that at one point without thinking of Barbara Windsor turfing people out of a pub. So even though it's a lot darker than that, like, you know, it's based on The Shining. I mean, The Shining was not exactly happy-go-lucky, like, woo, love all of this joyful stuff that's going on. But I think, again, this is a book that I now really want to go and read. In much the same way, I mean, I have to admit, I, as a teenager, only read Wuthering Heights because of Kate Bush. So I think, as a result, a lot of these books will be ones that I only read because of our dear sort of honoured person that is the wonderful Kate Bush. But that is that album, The Dreaming, which was a lot more out there, and the album that she herself was worried about because she thought it might make her seem like she'd lost the plot. And I mean, as much as it feels on the album, it's still bloody good. It's really good. Anyway, next we come to one of the albums that made Kate, I keep on saying Kate like we're best friends, like, oh, you know, like Kate and I, like we go for coffee. I wish. But we go to the album that made Kate Bush even more of a kind of part of a kind of a legend within sort of music, and that was her album Hounds of Love. Now this is like a double-sided album. This album contains some of her biggest songs, her sort of most well-known songs. It was formerly very inventive, and it's split into these two parts that it's split into are, well, the whole second half, the ninth wave, is this whole beautiful part of this woman who has basically been shipwrecked, and it's a sort of suite of songs that basically follows her thinking that she has died or is about to die, and she kind of gets rescued from this sort of icy water, but in sort of doing so, she has these sort of almost delusions where she's convinced that she's dying, and she's convinced that the things that she's seeing are not coming true. And this is, I think, this part of the album especially is one that like I overlooked massively when I was a teenager, and then listened back to a lot later and was just completely in love with it. This is, I think, of all of her albums, the one that feels most like a novel, in the sense that we've got this real chart of a narrative of following this story of this woman who is convinced that she's about to die, and she starts almost, you know, she's sort of in and out of consciousness in this cold water, and then she gets saved, and it goes into this beautiful song called Jig of Life that is just the most celebratory, beautiful thing. And when I finally realized what this part of the album was doing, I like ever since the Jig of Life has just not only made me incredibly happy, but also made me really want to cry. There's just something so powerful about it. Anyway, I'm going to stop before I actually start welling up about this. But there are two big literary references that come in with this album. So in the liner notes within the album, it uses some quotes from Alfred Lord Tennyson, who, and particularly the Ninth Wave. That title comes from a poem by Tennyson, and it's so beautiful, just in kind of the way she sort of weaves that through those songs. But on the first half, there is also a really joyous song called Cloudbusting. And I've spoken about this book a little bit recently. There is, and even what I love is the book has now been published with a sort of subtitle that is the book that inspired Kate Bush's hit song Cloudbusting. And this is A Book of Dreams by Peter Reich. So, long story short, Cloudbusting, the song, is all about a young man who is trying to protect his father and is the sort of young dreamer. And the whole cloudbusting thing comes from the idea that Wilhelm Reich, his father, thought that he could, well, was trying to create a machine that would be able to create clouds and make it rain. And the song is beautiful. The music video is gorgeous as well. It involves Kate with like short cropped hair, pretending to be little Peter Reich, running around being like, Dad. And it's weird now reading A Book of Dreams, because there are so many lines in the song that now feel incredibly poignant with this book. So I can't hide you from the government is one of the lines. Wilhelm Reich was targeted by the FBI because he was seen as being quite dangerous and radical, because he had all of these views about organon, which is the sort of life force energy sort of thing, and he was seen as really dangerous by the government because it was seen that he might be some kind of secret agent, or especially sort of an Austrian in the US, and he had all these sort of ideas that to everyone else seemed sort of cuckoo. And there's a scene really early into this book where Peter Reich is burying a yo-yo, and if you know the song, that comes up. But the whole reason he's burying this yo-yo is because it's a sort of light up sort of yo-yo, and Wilhelm Reich is really concerned that if his son is caught with this, it'll be seen as them doing some kind of crazy witchcraft, sciencey kind of bits. And there's a recurring line in Cloudbusting by Kate Bush, which is, I hid my yo-yo. I hid my yo-yo in the... in the front yard. I can't hide you from the government. And you know, the song references it so much. So I still believe in organon is the first line. Organon being that sort of life energy. There's you know, all this kind of talk about the government, the FBI, and sort of dreaming, wanting to really protect his father. It is such a gorgeous song, and I loved it already, but reading this book, my goodness, you've just got this young, innocent boy really wondering why everyone wants his father to be locked up and why he's seen as dangerous, when to him, his father is this dreamer, is this sort of man who has so much vision, who's really kind and loving and warm and brings his son in, but also at the same time has to shield his son with tales of, you know, don't do this, or if the government ever ask you anything about me, pretend you don't know, or hide this if they come. It's beautiful. And now I think, listening back to that song, I'm just going to cry. I'm going to cry a lot because it's beautifully done. And I don't think I'd realised how much inspiration Kate had taken from this book. I kind of imagined it was originally that it was a made-up story. Then when I found out it was a real story, I imagined that she'd watched like a documentary on it. I didn't realise there was a whole book from Peter Reich talking about how his dad was taken away in the midst of sort of a US government lockdown on sort of dangerous characters. Yeah, it's a lot. But beautiful book and beautiful song either way. We come next to Kate Bush's next album, The Sensual World. Sensual? Sensual? That. I don't know how I say that word anymore. But the title song of that album, that the name I can't pronounce, is taken from the inspiration of Ulysses by James Joyce. I've spoken a bit about James Joyce and Ulysses on my channel before. I had to read that book at uni. Still don't fully know how I feel about it. But there is a gorgeous, gorgeous passage at the end of that book where Molly Bloom, I believe it is finally talking for herself for the first time. And it's entirely in sort of stream of consciousness. I think it's something like 50 or 60 pages, and there are something like 7 sentences, as in, you know, it meanders, it kind of goes through these bits. It had one of the last sort of sets of lines of it is, yes, I said yes. And it's kind of without any pauses. There's something quite powerful about that. And in context of the book, it makes a lot more sense. And Kate Bush, when she first wrote this song, wasn't able to get approval from the estate of James Joyce to use real lyrics. So there are kind of workarounds. So she will kind of say, like, it has yes as a recurring line. You know, touch of seed cake in my mouth. All of those little bits that are kind of little references to the book and especially that passage, which is gorgeous. Then she had later she re-released this album and sort of released director's cut, which gave her the ability to talk a little bit more about some of these things. And she re-released this as The Flower of the Rose, and was able to use Kate Bush use Ulysses lines and words in it, and which really adds to that feeling. Both are beautiful, but it's interesting to see when you actually get the sort of real words from Molly, and there's something really special about it because it feels like Molly is breaking through and talking and having agency and power. And I love that when you kind of get characters in books who are kind of not necessarily underdeveloped, but kind of have something perhaps unresolved in the book itself, and then somebody takes it outside of that and either rewrites it or adds something to it. Thinking of books like Carol Ann Duffy's The World's Wife, where she rewrites the histories of some women in history, either by gender flipping them, gender flipping men in history, or by imagining the partners or siblings or daughters of men in history. And there's something so powerful about recognizing those characters, that they haven't had their full arc, they haven't had their full narrative, and giving that to them. There's something so empowering and beautiful about that, and I think that's what's so special about that song. Even if Ulysses the book is a bit of a slog and is quite difficult at times, in my opinion. But there is also a reference to Jerusalem by William Blake. So we get more literary references, and William Blake is a poet who I've not spent nearly enough time reading, and the bits I have read I have really thoroughly enjoyed, so I need to go back and really check those out. There'll be a full list at the end of this as well, so kind of underneath the video. So there is a little Kate Bush reading list if anyone is interested, and I will be trying to work through it all myself as well. We also have some more literary references, and particularly a fairy tale reference in the next album, The Red Shoes. And this follows a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, which is all around this idea of a dancer who wears these red shoes, but cannot take them off, and so essentially dances to her death. Nice and cheery, which is, I mean, in fairness, very Hans Christian Andersen, very much those sort of old, like the grim fairy tales, and Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales are full of those, like in the original Cinderella, or Cendrillon as it sometimes is, or like Aschenputtel. It's kind of got various names depending on where it is, but it has sort of slight variations. But essentially a large part of that is quite brutal and violent. Like the Disney one is really quite nice overall. In the original Cinderella or Aschenputtel or Cendrillon, she chops the ugly sisters chop off parts of their toes so that they can fit into the glass slipper, which is grim, and they also at the end have their eyes pecked out by birds. They're a lot more brutal to Cinderella herself as well. So it's really not a happy tale. And you know, although she still gets that sort of loving ending, there is a little bit of like, and everyone else died, but Cinderella was happy. And she, you know, I think in the Disney film, there's an idea that those sort of the two ugly sisters and the stepmother will sort of begrudgingly become better people, or maybe will just sort of have slight punishment. But like in like the original tale, they just full on get like attacked by animals and die. so, so hence the red shoes as well, where you know you've got this woman who just sort of dances to death because she can't stop dancing. Whereas in the Kate Bush song, it's quite cheery. Like it's like she can't stop dancing. It's a little bit like, and I mean it does have the line like she's gonna keep dancing until her legs fall off. But it kind of sounds weirdly comical and light and funny in the song, whereas the story is less that. It's a little bit darker. But that's all good. That's all to be expected in nice, good old fairy tales. Now, the next two albums that Kate released, at least in terms of her studio albums, as far as I can find both online and sort of from my own thinking around the albums, don't have any direct literary references that I can find. But Ariel is a beautiful album that kind of weaves in ideas of the number pi and Joan of Arc and her son talking about birds, and it's stunning. I love it. I adore it. I want this to be a book because I feel like it would also be my favorite book. This is for me, one of the best albums that's ever been made. I love it. There's an incredibly sad and beautiful song on it called The Coral Room, where a coral room where she talks about her mother's passing away, and it's just one of the most stunning things I've ever heard. I think it's easy to kind of, I remember when I first listened to the album, I thought that it was a funny song because it has at one point a lyric about washing machines, which is sort of like splishy, sploshy, splishy, sploshy, get that dirty, shirty clean. But actually, the more you delve into it, it is just stunning. And the same for the album that followed, 50 Words for Snow? Yes, 50 Words for Snow, which has all of these beautiful moments around winter, and there's a kind of real quiet hush that falls over the book. And nothing really has sort of done that for me sort of with music really in a really long time. But there are some books that also it kind of, you know, it feels like a literary album in itself. There must be some sort of literary reference I'm missing. But it's just gorgeously done. But there are many other books that are related to Kate Bush that aren't necessarily directly from those albums. So, apart from those studio albums, she also at one point released a single called Lyra for His Dark Materials films, particularly that first film, which the film was The Golden Compass, but the book is The Northern Lights, or just Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. Again, long-term subscribers may realise that this is one of my favourite book series ever. So it was incredibly exciting to see Kate do the song for it. And it's such a gorgeous song. So it talks about, you know, like armies stand behind her. Armies stand in front of her. Yeah, before her as well. It's so wonderfully done, this sort of recurring idea of Lyra throughout. I mean, I'm biased because I love Kate and I love His Dark Materials, but for me it's just such a gorgeous film song. It's very sweeping and soft and calm and powerful, and it's just such a nice kind of collision of two of my favourite things, and it makes me incredibly happy. But in terms of other wider Kate Bush songs, so I think as far as I'm aware, those are most of the big literary references. I am perfectly aware that I have probably missed something major, and please pick me up on that in the comments, because I'm sure that there is more to add to this sort of Kate Bush reading list. But two other books that I would recommend that talk about our beloved Kate are firstly the biography of Kate Bush by Jovanovic, which I remember reading ages ago and absolutely loving. It does a really interesting thing of sort of breaking down what her career looked like and thinking a bit about who she was or who she is and her kind of process for making music and all those sorts of bits. But there is also something a little bit more off the wall that I absolutely adore. A friend of mine gave me this as a present when I was at uni, and honestly, it's one of the best things I've ever been given. And this is Adventures in Kate Bush and Theory by Deborah M. Withers. Now this, I think I've spoken about briefly about on another, in another video, but this takes the idea of it creates what they term the BFS, the Bushian female subject, which is the Kate Bush female narrator or subject in her songs, and she uses that as a way to look at feminist, queer, and post-colonial theory. So bear with me. This is a bit what. So my hair's really out, whatever. But yeah, bear with me on this. So essentially, I mean, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, this book, but it's wonderful. So it takes this idea of what, you know, that the first album, The Kick Inside, took this idea of a young woman who was sort of finding her identity, and it follows this sort of Bushian female subject through various songs. So sometimes we have a woman kind of on the cusp of maturity. Sometimes we have a woman in her first relationship. In later albums, we have older women looking back over their lives, and it really charts it through that. And I mean, it's brilliant because it's like, I was reading this while I was at uni and studying queer theory and post-colonial theory and lots of feminist theory. And to have it applied to Kate Bush is just so hilarious, especially when you start seeing like the chapter titles. So for example, Lionheart and the Queer Life of the BFS, the Bushian female subject, because that second album, Lionheart, has, for example, a song about two gay men in love with each other in Baghdad, in Kashgar from Baghdad. It also has Wow, which is all about a gay man. It's a very gay album, including a line that completely went over my head many times when I first listened to it, which is, he's too busy hitting the Vaseline, which I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, cool, Vaseline, not realising the kind of gay implications of Vaseline being used as lube. Again, completely missed that. I love her. I'm not sure if this has been made clear, but for example, we also have The Red Shoes and the Death of the BFS. So the idea that The Red Shoes is an album that deals with a woman kind of reaching her end. So whether the woman dying in red shoes from dancing too much, or kind of other themes of death and loss kind of coming in, or a rebirth and lots of other things. Really silly, really fun, but such a brilliant little book, and I adore it. So, as far as I'm aware, those are all of the literary references in Kate Bush. Again, I'm sure that I have missed many. I am happy for you to point those out in the comments. But if it has not been made clear, I am a huge fan of hers. She's brilliant. And I realise this video is like a niche within a niche within a niche, right? It's like BookTube is already somewhat niche at times. And then looking at literary references in Kate Bush maybe is a niche too far. I'm fully anticipating that this video will have like 5 viewers. And also on that note, a massive shout out to The Quiet Midden, who was kind of, I think I mentioned Kate Bush in a video like ages ago, and they kind of were like, oh my god, Kate Bush, Kate Bush. So it is to honour them that I'm making this, and also to honour the wonderful Kate Bush. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed that. Take care, and please listen to Kate Bush. She's great. Especially Ariel, which is, I think, one of the best albums ever made. Anyway, I'm going to stop. Bye-bye. I've been Bob the Bookerer, showing my love of Kate Bush, and have a wonderful day. And also just sweating constantly. Have a great day. Bye.